Hi, I'm Sandra Peaston. I am not a data scientist. I'm here today to get you thinking about where spatial data science techniques could be employed. So I am the Director of Research and Development at CIFAS, a fraud prevention organisation that works with about 550 UK companies to help them share the details of cases of fraudulent conduct that they have suffered in order to prevent the details of those cases then being used again against another organisation in the network to perpetrate further fraud. So basically, we hold a database of cross-organisational, cross-sector fraud intelligence where there is sufficient evidence in each case to substantiate it being reported to the police. And in fact, they're all fed into the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, housed at City of London Police. Now, the insurance industry, as an example, has used geographical analysis for years in order to investigate false insurance claims. For example, why, when a bus has been involved in a collision, where there is an unusually high number of personal injury claims, when for the people making those claims, that bus route is nowhere near where they live, where they work, or anything else to do with their life. That's the sort of analysis that can then start leading investigators to dig deeper. Fraud, though, is increasingly digital. It's increasingly both enabled and perpetrated online and through online channels. So where does geographical analysis then fit in this increasingly virtual fraud environment? Well, I'm going to share my screen. And now that I've managed to successfully share my screen, hopefully, talk through a couple of scenarios which can get you thinking about how spatial data science techniques could be employed in these situations to help prevent or identify fraud. So to start with, I'm going to talk about the situation around identity fraud, specifically where someone is impersonated in order to gain new accounts in their name. This is a type of fraud which is perpetrated online about 95% of the time. It's commonly enabled by data that's been stolen through data breaches, for example. It's been sold online, often dark web markets, but surface web as well. It's augmented with data found in things like open source sites on social media, and it may be socially engineered out of the genuine person as well. So the one thing, though, that a fraudster often has to do is make sure that they use their victim's genuine current address when they're perpetrating the fraud. Because if it's different from the victim's genuine current address, that's often quite an easy thing for organizations to be able to identify. So therefore, you need to be tying that individual to that correct address. For some products, that isn't a problem for the fraudster because everything is handled digitally. However, if the product involves mail being sent to the address about the product, which the fraudster even needs, because that's the point. Say, for example, they've applied for a credit card and they need to get their hands on that bit of 2-inch by 3-inch bit of plastic, then they need to be able to intercept that mail. Similarly, if documentation about their fraudulent application was to come into the hands of the victim themselves, then that would tip them off and they would take steps to undo the damage that the fraudster's been doing. So again, they may need to intercept that. And if you need to intercept mail, then proximity becomes a factor. Now, if I show you this image, what we've got here is a housing estate. This is a genuine example. And we've got the little star on the map there. That was the location of an application for a new product. Let's call it a credit card for the sake of argument. Now, if we put a radius around that application, then what we have within that radius and very close to it are all of these little red dots. And these red dots represent an identity fraud perpetrated from those addresses or using those addresses within a very close geographical location to where that application was submitted to. And what this is telling us is that there is an identity fraudster who is operating in that location. They are, for example, sticking their hands through the letterbox, not the most likely, but it's potential. They could have purchased an external mailbox from something like B&Q, particularly useful if the resident of a property happens to be on holiday and has helpfully mentioned that on social media. They'll put that box outside of the property. The postman then puts the mail directly in that box, and they can pick the box up and go. It might be that these are blocks of flats and they have got communal mailboxes, or mail is left in the easy accessible place for someone who can gain access to those flats. It might be that the identity fraudster has recruited the postie and they're just handing that mail over. Or, feasibly, it could be the postie themselves. There are many ways in which someone could be getting access to that mail, but what we can see here is that there is someone who is operating in a tight geographical location. And we have an alerting system in place on our database, which defines a radius around which these rules apply. It puts a time frame on it, so how recent are the cases that need to have occurred within that radius, and how many cases need to have occurred within that radius. And if you have a application at an address where there are a certain number of cases within a certain time frame, within a certain radius, then an alert will be delivered to that organisation who's received that application. Now, we also allow organisations to tailor some of those variables depending on their risk appetite. But what this doesn't do is take any account of the nature of the areas that they're operating in. And if we take a look at another example, you'll see what I mean. So what we have here is tower blocks. And there's an application for, let's use credit card again for the sake of argument, that happened in that flat there, indicated with a cross. Now, if we then apply our radius, and within that you can see that we have got a number of other identity frauds that have been identified in that close radius. They're in a close proximity, practically on top of each other, in some cases literally on top of each other, but we're in a highly urban area here, closely packed properties. And actually what we want to make sure is we're not alerting or creating false positive alerts. We don't want people to be wasting their time investigating things which aren't actually connected. So within this tight, highly dense area, you would expect that you would need to see a higher number of previous identity frauds within that area for that to then be relevant for an organisation to investigate that. However, identity fraudsters also target more rural areas. They target those areas where the residents are deemed to be more affluent, probably in bigger properties, spaced further apart. In these situations, they might very helpfully also have things like their mailboxes at the end of their extensively long driveways. So in that situation, you are going to have less highly dense properties in the area. So therefore, the likelihood of relevant cases being within that radius decreases. So you can start to see there how the difference in makeup and the nature of the area will have an impact on what an appropriate radius is to start considering cases within. However, if we get back at this image, you can see on the right-hand side, we've got a major road. Now, if we had a situation where there were properties the other side of that major road, you know, that major barrier that sits between where your application's been received and where some identity frauds might sit, might mean that those identity frauds the other side of that major barrier aren't relevant to you. So this is another consideration, you know, what barriers are in place that we should be looking at. So for this scenario, how can we factor in the different types of property? Is it a flat? Is it a detached house? In these different types of population density areas, are they closely packed? Are they further apart? Where there might be major obstructions, or where you might have a property which sits on the extreme edge of an area of concern, for example, perhaps abutting an area which has got very different characteristics, perhaps, you know, an industrial estate for the sake of argument. Where in those circumstances, using the address where you've received an application as the middle of the area might not actually be the most appropriate. So how can we take all of these different factors and bring them together in order to optimize those cases that are most likely to be indicative of identity fraud, and at the same time minimize those false positives. So that's scenario one. Let's now move on to looking at money mules, which may or may not be a term that some of you are familiar with. But money mules are those who have been recruited to move illicit funds through their bank accounts, essentially launder money. Criminals use networks of bank accounts to move money rapidly from the point it enters a network. So, for example, if someone has been a victim of a scam, an authorized push payment fraud, they would then get their victims to pay money into destination accounts. That money would then move rapidly through a network of accounts in order to frustrate any efforts to track those funds, in order for then the criminals then to be able to cash out at the end of it. That might be a cash point, it might be overseas, it might just be somewhere where we've lost sight of where that money's gone. But you get the idea of what we mean by a mule network in this situation. Now, often mules are young people, not exclusively, but most frequently. And in a high number of cases, they will have been recruited online. And you can see some of the types of recruitment adverts in the images on this slide. Now, it could be that these people being recruited are even not aware that what they're being asked to do is money laundering. It is a criminal offence. Or it might be that the amount of money that they get offered in order to do this just counterbalances any consideration that they've got about where that money has actually come from. However, while a lot of the recruitment does happen online, that's not to say that it all does, or that the way people are recruited doesn't have a geographical element to it. So universities are known as a hub for this, potentially through recruitment then happening through university-specific online groups. Or it might be that they're just being recruited in bars on campus. Worryingly, there have been reports of recruiters hanging around school gates. So where you've got sixth forms, where some of the students are old enough to hold their own bank account, then you can get recruiters just basically turning up at schools. Sports clubs has been cited as another example through investigations. And there was one particular example where the coach of a football club, a local football club, he was recruiting the kids that were attending the club, apparently without actually realizing that it was money laundering and it was a crime. He just thought it was a nice way for the kids to make a bit of extra money. Or so he said. So there is our first question. How can we use geographic data? So, for example, the addresses where the accounts used to money launder are held, in order to understand where recruitment is taking place. And if we understand where recruitment is taking place, then we can focus education and awareness campaigns to make sure that no one is entering into this sort of activity with their eyes shut. And we can also focus any potential law enforcement activity as well. But there are other aspects to a geographical footprint, even if the recruitment itself has happened completely online without any real world kind of focus point. So sometimes the criminal will buy someone's debit card off them, and that will often then be to cash out, use it at cash points. And it might be that those cash points are within a particular geographic location. But can we actually see any patterns around where withdrawals are taking place? Are they along bus routes? Are they along train lines? Can this be then used to start predicting where cash outs might actually take place? And what about the location of other activities by these organised crime groups, OCGs? What other criminal activity is being undertaken in these geographic areas? Do these other types of crimes in areas give an indication where money mules could start to be recruited, or where cash out might start to occur next? Or is it actually the other way around? Does the mule recruitment come first? Do increases in other types of crime in an area give us that kind of indication? Are we actually able to then start bringing all of these factors together to gain a greater understanding of how mule networks operate, in order to then help us identify those points of education and awareness and where we can have these points of intervention? So that's just a couple of areas where you might like to start thinking around where some techniques that you might be familiar with could be employed. So just looking at those two areas, those themselves, I think, present opportunities for prevention of further crime operationally, or to target those awareness campaigns and law enforcement evidence. So I hope that has given you some food for thought, and thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Sandra. It was really insightful and interesting to look at fraud and scammers through the lens of location. Not something I had thought so much about before, but we are really happy that you could join us. We have a question on the chat from Gerrit Gennis, who asks, how do you identify the location of applicants and potential perpetrators? Are you typically using an IP address?
So most of it is based around, the addresses they actually use. If there are a fraudulent applicant or perpetrating identity fraud, then there needs to be something that will pass the various identity verification checks and mean that mail will be delivered as well. So they pretty much have to use the right address. That doesn't mean that they are at that address, but it gives us a place to start. IP address can be useful. Particularly, I think, more in the investigative space, law enforcement space. But again, it's not the most reliable of sort of entities to use to base it on. So it's, some of it, to get reliable location of either victims or perpetrators, you need to be looking at the type of fraud that is occurring in order to give you an idea about whether or not they are at least likely to be in that vicinity.
Right, okay. And then Peter Elliott has a question. Are these operations based on traditional hotspot analyses?
So again, it depends on the nature of what's being looked at. You can get networks which are entirely cross-jurisdictional in the UK. It's difficult for policing in some situations to work out whose case it actually is, because you can get an indication that the perpetrators in one police force area and victims are elsewhere. But hotspotting does help, particularly in those types of frauds which do have more of a local organised crime element to it. There are certain types of fraud which tend to be perpetrated within particular communities or within particular gangs who work in geographic locations. So yes and no, I think, is a shorter answer.
And during COVID, Sandra, have you seen kind of a peak in any particular types of fraud that can be resolved, well, not resolved, but analysed geospatially? Any new use cases?
So I think the biggest increase in fraud that we've seen in the COVID period has been around what we call APP frauds, authorised push payments, basically people being scammed. So this is then the things that then lead into the money mule activity from there on, because it's opened up a whole range of different areas where people can be deceived out of their money because they're unfamiliar with it. You need to pay for a vaccine, you needed to pay for PPE, your broadband's going to be cut off if you don't pay us money, that sort of thing. However, there are certain types of government backed things like the bounce back loan schemes, some of the grants that have been made available for struggling businesses, which unsurprisingly fraudsters have been trying to take advantage of, and some of that will be geographically based. However, it's largely been fraudsters either in this country or overseas trying to get people to remotely pay their money away, which has been one of the major concerns. Right.
Wow, very creative fraudsters out there. So thank you very much for sharing these stories, Sandra, and for preparing your presentation. We look forward to seeing you hopefully at other events in the future.